Welcome, everyone, to Alone is Not Enough panel. Really excited to be here. I'm talking to you from the greater Seattle area and really happy to be joined by panelists from literally across the country, spreading to the East Coast. So it's very exciting to be able to have the conversation with such a great group of people and to be talking with all of you as well. Thank you to the Adoptee Lit Fest leadership, who's been great to work with and so warm and communicative and great at troubleshooting. And we're just really happy to be part of this and to hopefully contribute to what is a worthwhile conversation.
Hi,
Um,
I just wanted to give a
yes,
few housekeeping notes.
yes.
We're so thrilled to have this panel here, and I just wanted to remind everyone that we will not be having a live chat from the audience from participants, but you can put any questions into the Q&A, and the panel will be able to see those and will be responding to them. And you can use closed captioning if you want to. There's a CC button at the bottom if you need that and you want that. And there will not be, we will be putting links to everyone's bios in the chat so you can see their full bios. We'd like to give the panel enough time to have their conversation, and you can read the full bios in the chat. And I will be slipping away now and letting Nari take it away.
Thank you, Susan. So our plan for our time together is for each of us panelists to briefly introduce ourselves, answering the question, what brings you to this space? And then after each of us have taken a minute or two to answer that question, we'll launch into the panel discussion, which will be the majority of our time. And then towards the end of our time together, we'll open the floor to Q&As. So I'll take a stab at that first question. We're not going to really be talking about like the kind of bios that you see, you know, on websites and magazines and everything. You're welcome to check out those links that they're putting in the chat. But we just wanted to answer this question of what brings us here, because ultimately this conversation that we're going to be having is about belonging and community. And so we panelists wanted the opportunity to be able to kind of share with you why we personally find the topic of this panel important and what brings us into this conversation. This panel actually began as a texted conversation I was having with Jonathan Whitmire, who's also on this panel. And how we became friends might kind of come to the surface later in our panel discussion. But ultimately, a few months ago, we were talking about how lonely we are, even though we're friends, how hard it is to find a sense of literary community that also relates to or connects with our adoptee identities. And it's hard enough to find one or the other, the adoptee community or the literary community, but to find a place that where we feel at home with both of those facets of ourselves was really difficult. And we didn't arrive to any particular answers, but that kind of those questions were planted in our minds. And so when I saw that the Adoptee Lit Fest was happening again, I was really excited to propose this panel as a way to pursue possible answers to that question. And my writing background is actually more essayist. So how I see the world is not so much about finding an objective answer that's out there waiting to be uncovered, but it's more about investigating possible answers to questions that never really end or fully resolve. Um, so I'm really excited to be talking about this topic with all these delightful and wonderful people. And I will open the floor to Stephanie, Rob, and then Jonathan to answer that question of what brings you to this space.
Yeah, so what brings me to this space? I'm an adoptee. I'm also an author, and my debut novel, First Love Language, is about exactly that. It's about learning Mandarin and reconnecting to culture and finding family. And I think that is kind of like a core experience. Like, I think the thing with being an adoptee is that there's no like one way to be an adoptee. We all have like we all come from vast different experiences, but there are some like core truths to them or core elements about the experience. And one of them is like absolutely family and community. Because I think growing up, like, even though as a step parent adoptee, I did get to grow up with my biological siblings, I didn't grow up with like my biological parents. And so I think like because of that, I've always had this like longing, this need to have like what everybody else takes for granted completely fulfilled. And I think another thing too is that like being an adoptee is really a vulnerable experience, but so is being an author, because you're putting all of your emotions on pages and things like that. And those types of experiences, they require a lot of safety. Like, in order to be vulnerable with yourself, you have to have that community who supports that vulnerability. And so I think like having a topic as deeply important as community within adoption and the publishing space, like, I'm really grateful to be on this panel, and I'm really excited to hear everybody's answers too.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. That's very powerful, and that's and Nari, those, what's interesting to me, and one of the reasons that brings me to this space is that, I grew up with several adoptee siblings as well. I'm an adoptee from foster care. I'm a Indigenous essayist and poet and arts leader. My current role is executive director of Poets House in New York. And by the way, there's a lot of sirens happening outside. I don't know if New York City is being audible to everybody else out there, but if it is, welcome to New York. But yeah, so my story is very much similar, that a lot of my life has been trying to connect with a kind of community, and I found myself building little families of my own through friendships, or once I started connecting into the arts, and especially the creative arts, a real deep need to connect with other people around the arts. So I would, create little writing groups, and then I was drawn to opportunities that let me build community, and which is still being expressed right now in the current roles that I have. Before this at Hugo House in Seattle, and here at Poets House in New York City. So that community building is has been a really important part of my work as well, my work life. And yeah, I don't know, from uh yeah, I don't know. I guess that's it, really. That's what drew me here specifically today. And I'm sure there's more I'm going to get into in a moment, but I'll pass it to Jonathan now.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Rod. I would say for me, so what brings me here, I would say I'm someone that's kind of always been looking for community as a transracial adoptee, being from like a predominantly white middle class suburb, not being around people that kind of looked like me. I've always kind of been looking like, where are my people? Like anywhere. And as I've kind of moved through different stages in life, going off to college, being part of an MFA program in New York, still always kind of looking. And a little bit about me, I'm also in the PNW, like Nari. Pretty new to the PNW, actually, though. Only moved here almost 2 years ago now, but it still feels very new to me. And like being a transplant in a new city and also being an adoptee, like coming out here initially, like really trying to find that community was something that was super important. And it's kind of been on the forefront of my mind, even though it has been 2 years, but it still feels very new. So something like I've tried to do coming out here, trying to find other adoptees, immersing myself in the literary community. Um, yeah, I think community is something that's really crucial for adoptees. So happy to be part of this panel and be part of this discussion.
Thank you, everyone, for sharing and kind of getting the ball rolling. So we will launch into the panel portion of this time together. And I wanted to note our approach to it, which might be slightly different from some panels that you all have attended. So I've been part of panels and also moderated a panel where it has an almost kind of classroomy energy, where the moderator is kind of standing up and kind of literally, speaking vertically downward to panelists, and it has a kind of formal, like kind of vertical energy. And what I was hoping more out of this one, and what we're going to try to accomplish in our format, is to have a more conversational format. We have prepared questions ahead of time, but we also wanted to kind of go with the energy and to have what feels like a more kind of lively format rather than just a moderator standing and asking questions one after the other. So that's going to be what we're aiming for. And I will also say that part of the reason for this format is that I somehow landed in this moderator seat and I don't really like to moderate. And so this is one way that I'm making my own sense of belonging and community is to try to like structure this panel in a way in which I can also be participating in the conversation rather than just answering or asking questions. So I will get the ball rolling and ask the first question, and Rob will be the first one to answer it. And then from there on out, we're going to be taking turns asking those questions. All right, so the first one, which is one that I'd posed a while back, I'd mentioned being an essayist. And so I was wondering from all the panelists, how do the genres that you write in make you aware of your need for belonging?
Okay, so I'll start. Thanks, Nari. And I know that in our previous conversations, our planning conversations, I advocated for this question because I think it's so interesting. The question about genre and the link between genre and belonging, as well as sort of craft. And how one tells one's own story. So a little background for me, I'm a little older than the other panelists, and I was raised under the old workshop model, and particularly raised to write, drawn to the lyric poem specifically. So the lyric poem is very internal. It's very much cult of individual genius. It's very much about writing in solitude. And for me, what that meant is it felt very limiting. It felt like I couldn't, it felt both isolating and limiting. And as I started to write more into my own stories, I started to just decide that I needed to tell the story, that I was drawn to writing the story of my adoption, and as well as my family story. I realized that I needed to abandon the lyric poem model, as well as the old workshop model. That was really about finding faults in the work you're doing, and finding and trying to create these little jewel-like perfections of poems. I needed to mess things up a little bit, but I also needed to develop a sense of clarity in how I told the story. I realized I was talking in code a lot, and my story involves domestic violence. It involves indigenous erasure and genocidal forces, and I needed to be very I needed the reader to be aware of those things. I also found myself being drawn to longer sentences, longer lines, which then led me into prose, where I was able to really more directly, although I called myself an essayist, I really feel like I'm writing very long poems. But the idea is that I'm able to talk more directly about the work that I'm doing. And as I've done that too, I've found myself being drawn into other communities as well. So exploring my indigeneity as a writer has allowed me to claim my indigeneity, which is something that I was never really allowing myself to do as an adoptee. As an indigenous person with an Anglo name, I always felt like I couldn't belong in that space. And so now I've been doing work with Indigenous Nations Poets, the poetry organization for Indigenous poets, and I'm able to feel like I can claim that sense of identity more. And that has also then looped around and circled back to impact the way that I write about my own story, and in my own work. So I'm exploring my heritage language, Chamorro, and the work that I'm doing. And it's been a really interesting sort of feedback loop. That the more I abandon these old models, the more I'm able to look for belonging, and find belonging in the communities that I'm connecting with. Does anybody else feel similarly? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I asked that question because like in you're an essayist as well, so I think genre, even though it's like this kind of artificial categorical system, like it really can put different pressures on you as a writer, and like it makes, I think, different genres as a writer, you tend to be like um um I guess held to a certain level of like accounting for yourself. Like so I think, for example, and maybe I'm saying this because I'm least comfortable around fiction, but I think that with fiction, if you're writing as a fiction writer, you can kind of to some degree be separate from the work that you're writing and not necessarily have everyone reading into every little thing that you write and saying, well, is this really this person? And, like kind of holding you accountable in kind of sometimes invasive ways. Um, so I find that as like a creative nonfiction writer, so many aspects of identity were being like um, incorporated into, like you were saying, Rob, about like the kind of traditional workshop model of where you kind of sit and listen to your piece kind of being like taken apart bit by bit. And I mean, I certainly learned things in that model, but it also just brought up all these what ended up being feeling like very kind of personal like questions about identity and who you are and kind of like having to explain myself. And I think that like burden to explain oneself feels especially heavy if you're writing something that you're calling memoir or personal essay, where it's not just like talk about this complex relationship you have with a parent, but it's talk about this complex relationship you have with the parent who was in your life after you were born and who is the only parent that you know, but doesn't look at all like you, who gave you a culture that your appearance doesn't necessarily align with. And you end up getting into all this kind of like um, territory that a lot of people, a lot of fellow writers even are not used to navigating. And so I think there's just kind of like for different genres, like different levels of like having to learn to like navigate those conversations. And that's even before you get to like working on the craft itself.
Yeah, Rob, I was really struck by something you said about like the workshop, and you also mentioned Nora, but like being in that space. I think it's funny you, Rob, talking about kind of your journey through the genres. It's kind of funny. I like think I might have started in fiction. I was a fiction writer to start, and I think I might have started that way because of I think the workshop environment. It wasn't until like much later in my writing career that I started really delving into like my experiences as an adoptee, but like being in like early workshops as like an undergrad, I think like being in those, using fiction as a kind of a way to like process them, but not really, and try to attack certain like themes and things without having to write about myself. Kind of looking back on it, I think that might have been one of the main reasons. And it's so interesting, like moving through the genres, like fiction for me is always about like trying to understand characters, deals a lot with empathy, thinking about other people, trying to understand people around you. And I think especially like how I've kind of moved through it. My fiction tends to be about the world that I grew up in. So a lot of my characters ended up being white in fiction, but it wasn't until started like moving through the genres, writing more poetry as of recently, and that tends to be more personal. Um, so it's kind of interesting, like the way genres kind of put up certain, I guess, guardrails and things, and you can kind of use them as sort of like a way to sort of shield yourself, especially from like, yeah, like critical sort of thought or critiques. Um, yeah, genre is very interesting in that way, especially I would say like at least with poetry being so personal for me, you tend to kind of dwell on things when you're writing that kind of like I guess autobiographical poetry, and that always kind of like you thinking about your experience and you're thinking like who is this audience I'm writing it for, and it kind of just lends itself to like sort of seeking out that community, like hoping to write for a community when it comes to that stuff. But yeah, genre is so interesting in that way.
John, do you think that's a good segue into that second kind of genre related question?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, so I guess I'll throw this to you, Stephanie. Have you seen your own writing evolve based on the different communities you've engaged with? Do you find yourself exploring new topics or genres based on the connections you've made in the literary or adoptee community?
Yeah, like for me, I, as a step-parent adoptee, as a biracial person, like it's always been hard for me to know where I belong. So never really felt like I could claim being adopted, because when I thought of adoption back in the day, it was, oh, you came from China. Well, I was born in Texas, or like me, even as a biracial person, well, I'm white passing. So like, can I really even say that I'm like Taiwanese? Or like, I know nothing about the language. I know nothing about the culture. Can I even claim this? But I will say that when like Shannon and Nicole, they created the anthology when we become ours, it was the first time I had ever experienced an adoptee community, and it was the first time I had ever experienced the fact that like, no, like my adoption trauma is a core part of my personality. The fact that I don't know where I belong, the fact that I am so lost and I'm so confused and I have such a depth of identity crisis that my entire life was built off of the trauma of like parental relinquishment and growing up by like a mother, growing up with a mother who like did not share my DNA, who did not understand my culture and everything. Like that is all inherently part that all falls under the adoptee umbrella. And so when I was finally able to like pour all of these emotions out on paper and turn it into a story, I was like, I'm not the only one who feels this way. Like, where has this been my entire life? And so I am forever grateful for Shannon and Nicole for just like opening up the gateway for me, and just like being so aware of themselves as well, that there is this void that needs to be filled, and that like I am adoptee enough to be in the adoptee community.
I'll hop in and share a little bit more about my connection with my indigenous, heritage, and I think that the idea of being adoptee enough or indigenous enough, has really haunted me as well. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that connecting with my indigenous um, community, but also with my indigenous family, being able to really claim that indigeneity and feel that, any story that I tell is a tomorrow story because I am tomorrow. I don't have to kind of represent a kind of tomorrowness. I don't have to have been, for me, tomorrow, I don't have to be raised on the islands to feel like I belong, that my story is good enough. And as I mentioned, I've also been exploring my heritage language. Stephanie, you talked a little bit about that as well. I mean, it feels so empowering, and it feels like a hole in my gut has been filled a little bit as I learn more of these pieces of language and kind of start understanding how language can impact who you are as a person too. It can kind of free different parts of your personality by learning different languages and being able to express yourself. And so that's a different level of belonging, I think. And I am also aware that language is also a very privileged kind of way of engaging. Not everybody has the ability to engage with the language, and only until recently have I been able to, because now there's Zoom, and there are Zoom workshops for Chamorro language, and Chamorro is not a very commonly spoken language, so access has been a big issue for me as well. But yeah, thanks for that, Stephanie.
Yeah, I think that concept of like belonging enough or being any one identity enough is always like something that is nipping at the heels of adoptees. I would say probably especially transracial adoptees. That feeling of being outside of a lot of doors and not really ever fully invited over the threshold. And I think that's, part of the impetus for some of the conversations that spawned this panel, was that sense of like finding different um, groups that felt like they might be home. And ones who were like adoptee groups or who were like BIPOC writers or things like that, and just feeling like maybe this is like the one where I'll feel like I'm truly with my people. And it never has really felt that way. And I think ultimately, I mean, there's um, that, like, as a friend says, the calls coming from inside the house. Like, I think in some ways, it's not something that other people and other communities can fix. It's not a hole that they can fill. Like Rob, you mentioned, like a hole in the gut. Like, I think those vacancies are ultimately probably are things that require my own internal recalibration for believing that, like choosing to believe and doing the work of belief that I do belong in a space that I don't necessarily initially feel like I belong in. And whether that's pursuing a particular language or dabbling in different genres. I think one way that I guess, put my foot down a little bit in terms of just finding a little bit of sense of belonging, again, kind of referring to kind of the literary and workshop experience, is instead of feeling like I have to explain myself all the time in my writing, like, oh, well, this is my uncle, but he's really my adopted uncle, or, just like always having to kind of fill in gaps for people to like explain things. Like, I'm feeling less and less onus, less and less pressure to explain everything. I think there's like this, for me, part of what makes me feel like belonging is so difficult to find is me always feeling like I can't make other people feel kind of confused, like that it's my job to erase their confusion or to manage their confusion, and that it's my problem to solve. And ultimately, I should be writing well, but it's not my job to make people think that maybe their small sense of the world should be bigger, and to like think outside of the box in terms of what family structures can be, what identity can be, what all those things are. And so I think there's something freeing, and with that, a sense of deeper belonging, when I just tell the story I want to tell without also taking on that work of handling everyone else's confusions and discomfort.
Oh my gosh, I just want to the idea of explaining oneself. I want to share a little anecdote about my first book that I've have finished another draft of. But when I was first drafting this book, I thought, oh my gosh, I need a family tree, and so I literally spent an entire day trying to make a family tree of the different strands of, because there are also in my adoptee family, there are also different adoptees. The numerology of my family is very intense. I think there are 5 fathers and 3 mothers, and in the family that I was, biologically, in the family that I was raised in. And so it's a very intense family tree, and it's really kind of like a family root ball, really, instead of a tree. But it's so that was kind of an interesting challenge, and I eventually abandoned it. But I tried various different versions, and Nari came to the same conclusion that you did, that it's not my job to explain it. And I have had to ask other readers to see if it's clear enough. But it's the fact that it doesn't need to be factual to such a deep degree to tell the story. That was a craft revelation for me, absolutely. Um, Jonathan, I didn't want to interrupt you though. Did you have something to say about this?
Yeah. So I was the idea of like being like adoptee enough and feeling like you sort of like you're confident enough to kind of write about and move through this space, and like the kind of burden that kind of comes with that, like the responsibility that people are kind of looking to, you're representing this particular group. Are you doing it right? Are you doing it in a way that like people are used to, or are you doing it in a way that people are kind of expecting? I think, again, thinking back to like the genre piece of it, I think writing in fiction to start kind of like came about because I didn't know a lot of like other adoptee writers or a lot of adoptee literature, and like that kind of lack of representation initially, not feeling confident enough, like I guess in my own sort of like these are like this is like back in undergrad still, like not feeling confident enough to write about my own experience and not having those sort of examples out there of like people who are doing it authentically in ways that like I felt were real and authentic. Without having that, I sort of like started off writing fiction. And it wasn't until like meeting other adoptee writers, meet like people like Nari, and other folks like who were delving in other genres, delving into nonfiction or writing fiction of their own or poetry, that I kind of was able to finally like maybe I can explore these other genres because I can kind of like see like this is how other people are doing it, and they're doing it in a way that's real to them, and it's less so always about like doing it the right way. Because there's so many different like there are all those tropes that we know, especially with like the orphan narrative and that kind of thing. But to me, finding writers who are writing about adoption like very, very particular ways and nuanced ways, I think that was like kind of the key, for me. But yeah, definitely have felt that at times, feeling like, yeah, am I the right person to be telling this story? Am I like adoptee enough? Yeah, I've definitely been there. Something else I was kind of struck with, and this brings up another question that we kind of had. What is one of your questions, Stephanie? I don't know if you wanted to go with that one, but the idea of like rejection, and kind of like how that affects your sort of longing for community.
Yeah, so I had asked the question earlier, how do you handle rejection sensitivity in an industry where there is a lot of rejection, and how does it impact your ability to create community? So yeah, if you want, you can answer that one, Jonathan.
Yeah, so yeah, I was really struck by that when you guys were kind of talking about that. Yeah, it's like writing about something that's so personal, like the topic of adoption. If you're someone who writes a lot of work that is either nonfiction or kind of like fiction or poetry, kind of like veiled as nonfiction, I guess, it can be very like deflating getting those like initial rejections starting out. And it adds a sort of like kind of extra sting to it. And it's hard not to like at times fall into the trap of like reading into those rejections where it's like they're not just rejecting your work, but they're also rejecting you and your story, especially when you're trying to write in a way that's authentic to you and trying to cut against like those sort of like stereotypical tropes that are out there. It can feel like it's not just like, you know, your work that's being rejected. It's like your own story, and it's like, do the publishers even want like an authentic? Do they want just like these sort of mainstream tropes that we've seen? And it can be very like confusing at times, and you're gonna feel very like you're on the outside looking in, and it's like, do I have to like craft my own story in a way that people want, or am I going to tell a story that's like authentic to me? And I found that like I've pondered that question at various times in all the genres that I've kind of tried to write in. But yeah, definitely I felt that way for sure.
Yeah, and I just want to kind of echo that a little bit with like my own rejection sensitivity and I guess rejection story, because in traditional publishing there is a lot of rejection. Like First Love Language was my debut novel, but it was not the first book I wrote. It was the 9th book that I wrote. I had been in the query trenches for 10 years. And the thing with rejection is like you just get told no, but you never get told why there is the no. And so I feel like for me, like a decade of being told no, 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 it kept on reinforcing this adoptee experience of mine, which was that I'm just not enough, or like there is something inherently wrong with me. And like just seeing how my publishing journey is also runs alongside my adoption journey, and about how like it took time for me to come out of the adoption fog. It took time for me to like really hone in on my craft and realize that like the reason why my voice is a little bit different is because my experience is a little different. And the reason why it's considered different is because there is not a lot of adoptee stories out there. And so finally honing in on that, finding my community, being validated in everything that I am, and knowing that like my voice is and my story is worth telling, it gave me a place to be. And it kind of, I can't ever say that it healed my wound, but it definitely mended it. It definitely mended that broken part of me that just needs validation, that just needs to be told like, hey, you know, what happened to you was a really shitty experience, and like, you know, but it's not your fault, and never is it like really the adoptee's fault. Like I got adopted by adults, like I had no say in whether or not I wanted to be adopted, you know, that sort of thing. So I think like, yeah, they just the adoptee experience and the traditional publishing experiences, that I think they just like run hand in hand together like that. And then Rob, did you want to answer that one?
Well, yeah, thank you. I actually have a different angle to this because I've been part of the systems of rejection for so much of my career. My first jobs out of grad school were I first started a literary magazine right out of grad school, and then I went to work for the magazine Plowshares, and reading and rejecting and just sending rejection after rejection after rejection, and then working at another literary magazine and small press, and then being a literary agent later on. It made me as a writer not want to participate in that process, and it made me and eventually it led me into other forms of community building that were, for me, I thought, what I was doing was being able to support the writers that I was really excited about, and building kind of support for and opportunities for BIPOC writers. When I was an agent, I was representing almost exclusively BIPOC writers, but the rejection, really did dig at me, and working in community spaces has really helped with that for sure. But it did make me not want to submit, and even now I have a hesitation to submit. And I had never quite, until you asked this question, Stephanie, I never quite linked it to my other kind of like innate want to belong. But I do think that there is a huge link there.
And Nari, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I was just something that keeps like dancing through my brain over the last several responses is something that just occurred to me, which is like I don't think many non-adoptees really are very interested in the real story of adoption. Like I'm reflecting on so many conversations I've had where people find out, oh, I was adopted. And the details I always want are like the beginning stuff, the origin stuff, like how old were you? Did your adoptive parents go to pick you up, or were you like, I don't know, FedExed? Or were you in foster care or an orphanage? Like, what was the exact situation of you being relinquished, and they want to know all that stuff that happened before I can remember what happened. And they never ask about or demonstrate any kind of interest in everything that comes after that, so I was adopted around 8 months old, from Korea, and I have told like that origin story, and it's coming out that the origin story that I was given may or may not actually be very accurate or truthful. But that classic story of being left on a porch and like being found and then being put into the system and all that. And I've told that story so many times to people, and then that kind of scratches their curiosity itch. And there are never like questions about the decades that have come after, like, what is it like, navigating high school or college or adult spaces as someone who has this kind of chronic sense of outsiderness? What is it? There aren't, and that's really the stories that I feel compelled to explore, are like, what's up with me now? Why am I so weird? Why do I have this, like I said, chronic sense of outsiderness? And I think that's the stuff that's the hardest to hear. And it doesn't scratch that like kind of natural itch that many of us have for just kind of like nitty-gritty trauma details, because it's harder to capture like that long, the decades long arc, and it's not, kind of coffee table conversation. And so anyway, to go back to like the idea of like rejection and just kind of navigating an industry that is really hard if you already have a sense of outsiderness, is that I think people are looking for, they aren't asking the right questions. They aren't looking for the right stories. They aren't cognizant of the fact that the kind of deeper stories that we're telling, and have heard a lot of like super smart points from all of you, and where it's clear that we're still deeply invested and there's still a lot of emotions involved with telling our stories, and they just aren't like asking those things or interested in those things.
And I think just to kind of like segue from the rejection question to a question that Jonathan had asked, the one under adoptee community at the very bottom. Jonathan, if you want to ask that one. About the challenges you faced while searching for community.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah. Yeah, something that I've always kind of thought about. I'm curious to hear what you guys think. And I think this, peeking in the chat a little bit, I think someone else had sort of a question similar to this. But like, yeah, what challenges have you faced in searching for or building community among fellow writers and adoptees?
I can start a little bit, because for me, most of I'm surprised when I come across other adoptees. I think that there's a lot of people don't lead with that identity, and I certainly didn't for a long time. And it's not been there's not a Kundiman for adoptees specifically, and so like and finally, thankfully, this conference exists, which has really helped a lot. But this and to build these connections, I went to grad school with Matt Salis, and we both knew each other really well and didn't know either of us were adoptees, and until later on, when he started writing more about it, and I found a sense of commonality with him, and it's for me, I think the challenge is really the discoverability and the findability, and the fact that people don't really lead with that, and then it's a surprise. So I mean, often for transracial adoptees, there's I mean, I said it earlier, being an Indigenous person with an Anglo name, that can happen, and that can be a clue. But other than that, it's still pretty opaque, I think. I don't know if that's your experience, Nari or Stephanie or Jonathan, but it has been for me.
Yeah, like I guess the biggest challenge I feel like that I've found in like building and growing the adoptee community is that, like, unfortunately, like there's a lot of like wolves in sheep's clothing kind of in the community. And what I mean by that is because like when we say like oh, I'm an adoptee or whatever, sometimes you get the adopters who have yet to decenter themselves from our narratives. I'm going to be very blunt about this and very unapologetic about this, because this is something that really irks me and gets under my skin. But I have gone to 2 book festivals thus far since being a published author, and I am 2 for 2 for these experiences. But it's where an adopter comes to me, says, oh, I'm an adopter. Here's my adopted child. Adoptee, tell this adoptee author why I'm so great. And I'm like, you're not an ally. You don't get it. You are not decentering yourself from our experiences. You do not have a right to tell the adoptee what to say about us. That is the issue that I am trying to combat with my book. And so yeah, that has happened twice to me for each of the literary festivals that I've gone to, and it's so discouraging, because like this is something I really want to talk about, but it's so difficult to talk about it because on one hand, I don't want to, piss anybody off. I don't want to start an argument or anything like that. But on the other hand, like I'm being authentic to me, and like this kind of prevents me from being authentic to me. But I think at the end of the day, though, it truly goes to show like how complex adoptee is, and why it's so hard to talk about this stuff. And like these are the everyday things that we're facing, because the adoption narrative was created before I was even adopted. Like, I was born in an era where the adoption narrative was still like, save a child, you're a great person if you do this, you're a hero, adopter, 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 give us money, money, money. And now all of us with our art are having to combat something that has been marketed for eons, before we even came into the scene, you know? So yeah, that's just like, it's incredibly frustrating. But and I would say that that is honestly my biggest challenge, is like, just because like you say you're adopted, or like that you're an adopter, I don't know that I can necessarily be vulnerable with you just because you disclose that. And it's like, okay, well, let's have a couple of conversations about it before like I can really get into like how I actually feel. Like, I still have to walk on eggshells even though you disclose that you're like a fellow adoptee or something like that.
Yeah, that's interesting. You made me think of an interaction I had in grad school where I was workshopping an essay about that involved being adopted, and the professor, whom I like a lot, but said something along the lines of, "This is a really compelling topic, explore in these ways. I've considered or I am considering adopting." And so there was this framing of, this is interesting to me. This is a perspective to me as a potential adopter. So your craft and your story and all that is somehow going to be in service to my own potential journey as an adopter parent. Um, and at the time, I don't think I was troubled by it, but as the years have gone by, like the more I think about it, the more I have similar thoughts as you, Stephanie, where it's like, oh, you're an adoptee. Great. So you can like fill in these gaps that I have, or these questions, satisfy my questions about it. Like, there's this kind of sense of, I would say, like emotional tourism, like this, like people can kind of like dip in and dip out, and they're requiring all this like difficult, very invasive personal work from you to kind of just get a sense of, it's almost like a restaurant review, to just get a sense of, oh, should I consider that, or am I interested, like, and it really, not only does it unfairly put so much work on us, but it also just cheapens the work too. Like, I'm not like a Fodor's, like this is a story that's really hard to put into words, and it's hard to share, and it's hard to workshop. And my job isn't to just, answer your casual questions. Um, John or Rob, did you want to add on anything to this conversation that we're having? Or I'm thinking in the near future, we should address some of the great questions that I've been seeing drop.
Yeah, I think some of these questions seem really interesting.
Okay. Is there any that you're compelled by, Rob?
I'm going to take a second to read them, but
Sure.
I mean, I think there's an interesting question that kind of relates to the question about rejection from Shelby about continuation and resiliency. What helped us continue writing and trying to get published after experiencing rejections initially? And I think, for me, it was partly stubbornness, partly just like an inability to do the basic math of of submitting, and really just a very um, just very much a need to tell my story. And, and it's not a perfect math, sometimes I get more frustrated than other times. And, you kind of like try to ride the waves of, of foolishness, when you feel like a brave and you feel like you can, you've written kind of like the next best poem that you've ever written, and you can just throw it out in the world. But it is not perfect math. But yeah, I think that just, the part of it, the most important part for me is the writing of it, and making sure that the writing continues to happen. And if you continue writing, you will continue getting published. And if you continue to kind of connect into communities, I found that publishing became a lot easier once I started becoming more connected into the communities that were available to me. But yeah, it's challenging. How did everybody else? How do you all handle that?
Yeah, I'll say, yeah, finding that community is really crucial. That's something that's helped me for sure. Just knowing people who also have been through all that rejection and have like little nuggets of guidance of like what to do and like, or just know of like contests that are opening up. Just knowing other writers helping you go through it, not doing it like by yourself, because the rejection you get alone, but you can kind of share in that with other people and lean on other people to kind of guide you. But yeah, like how to overcome that or continue on in the face of that, that's something that just, yeah, like if you have a story to tell, being sort of like, I guess, yeah, sort of stubborn in that way, like just like knowing that this your story is your own and that like you're the only person that can tell it, especially if you're writing stuff that is super personal, like just knowing like how much is out there that like how much ignorance there is about like the adoption and orphan narratives and that stuff, and knowing like that each of us individually has a very nuanced particular like experience and are writing about it in a nuanced way, just knowing that that is unique enough that that needs to be out there in the world and kind of like clinging to that. That's kind of what I've always sort of fallen back on, just like, yeah, this is my story and I don't see this one out there, so I'm gonna just keep sending it out and hopefully someone will we'll pick it up, and then that can be part of the rest of the fray. But yeah, that'd be my advice. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to answer Shelby's question. What helped you continue writing and trying to get published after experiencing rejections? Yeah, again, like echoing what Jonathan said, tenacity, just like never giving up on myself. And I have always been tenacious, and I didn't know why. I didn't know if it was like maybe just like I felt inspired, it was a passion of mine, whatever. But the crazy thing for my personal experience is that like I actually found my biological mom while this book was being published, and so I was able to like take her a copy to Taiwan and everything. And when I finally met my mom, I realized, oh my God, my tenacity came from you. Like we have the same personality. You are a firecracker, and like I had that too. So I'm gonna start crying, but like it's a story about how much I missed her, and in a way, she helped me write that book because you know, it never would have happened without like the tenacity that she gave me. So, yeah, I just wanted to, you know, share that cool little tidbit.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. I've really enjoyed becoming acquainted with you as we've been working on this panel, and that kind of firecracker element of you was so apparent on like our first interaction, and I've been just enjoying you and hearing more about your story so much. Um, I wanted to like just tack on my own thoughts about like I've been thinking more about like how this is actually rooted in some DEI training I was doing, but like this, like most scarcity is like constructed, right? It's imagined. It's like this agreement of value. And in reality, there are so many resources that there are plenty of for everyone, but we're somehow sucked into this system, this economy of scarcity, where there are a few things that are, and the most of which are enjoyed by a scant few, and then the rest of us are kind of like scrambling for the crumbs that are left over. And I certainly feel that that scarcity model is within the literary world as well. Like there's this idea of, you know, there are very few high-paying contracts, or very few contracts at all. There are very few spots in like these very famous journals, et cetera, et cetera. And we're always confronted with like this notion of scarcity. And unfortunately, that's kind of the system that we're given. Like we can try to disrupt as much as we can, but ultimately that's kind of what we're working within. And so sometimes what helps me in the face of like constant no's is this reality, this just recognition that we're all somehow part of this thing that is not about us personally. It's that we're all like within this larger kind of manufactured economy where things are harder to achieve and to get and to experience than it should be. It should be very easy to be able to put a beautiful poem out into the world, but sadly, it's not as easy as it should be. And so just kind of acknowledging that that exists, that I'm a part of it, and I can try to push back in my own ways, which personally have to do with like just trying not to, I don't know, trying not to feel like I'm participating in the rat race. Like I do submit things, but I try to like avoid some of the kind of ways of expressing it that kind of perpetuate some of that energy. And also just to tack on, like I think I've really appreciated like writings by like Robin Wall Kimmerer, who talks a lot about generosity and reciprocity and that idea of like just, yes, it feels like we're always being taken from and never getting anything in return, but we also should still be continuing to give and not let our spirit be broken. So like if I see an opportunity that I think a friend should really submit to, like just sending them a personal, hey, I saw this, made me think of you. You know, just publicizing different opportunities, like being sharing and not being like stingy, because stinginess just perpetuates the system of stinginess.
Yeah, and I just want to add very quickly, like, you know, believe in yourself, you know, I mean, trust your story, trust your, I mean, if, you know, trust that you're good enough, that the story you're writing, if it's your personal story, that your personal story is good enough. If it's a fictional story, the fictional story is good enough. Trust that you're good enough. And, you know, keep writing, just keep trusting yourself. You know, you are good enough, and the writing itself is the gift. So. And
Jonathan
there
or
was,
Stephanie?
sorry,
Oh,
Joe, go ahead.
sorry.
I was just
Oh,
gonna say the related question about building community,
yeah.
and my answer is very similar, which is, you know, build it yourself. You know, that if you're unable to connect, build a community around yourself, and that will help too. But there are also a lot of other, you know, organizations that do this work too of building community. But you also are empowered to build it yourself. So.
And I think that's one of the valuable things about like this space, like the Adoptee Lit Fest and this panel too, is that if you feel like building it yourself is too much for you alone, like this can connect you to other people that might be willing to collaborate with you or at least be supportive in some way to help you achieve that thing that you're missing. Jonathan or Stephanie, were there any other questions? We have just like 2 minutes left. Were there any other questions that you wanted to take a stab at responding to?
Oh wait, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize I was muted. Okay. Yeah. So just going off of what Shelby said, the second question that Shelby asked is that like how did your writing evolve? And ultimately, what changed from like the first 8 manuscripts that I wrote to like the one that actually like got scooped up by an agent and then later an editor, is the fact that like I was writing for myself for the first time ever. I thought traditional publishing was all about writing for the trend, understanding the genre. This is popping off right now. Dragons, that's hot, cool, throw them in there. No, it's like write the book you needed when you were that age. Like I write young adult, right? So this is what I needed to read when I was 17 years old. I don't know that I would have necessarily like received it well because like, you know, when you're in the adoptee fog, like you just get so deeply indoctrinated with the fact that like you were saved and no one was gonna love you unless you were adopted, like that whole thing. But like I wish I had this. I wish I knew that I was allowed to actually have these complicated feelings. Because I think another thing too about like the adoptee experience is that like I don't just feel angry about my adoption. I don't just feel sad about my adoption. Like there's so many layers to it. There's so much nuance to it. Like there's a little bit of like joy, there's a little bit of like a little bit of gratitude, there's a bit of rage, you know, like I feel a lot of these things at the exact same time. And I feel like I was surrounded by people who only ever had one way of feeling things or one way of expressing things. And like, but I needed those like, hey, everybody else around me is like happy, but like I'm feeling miserable. I needed other people who have also been like that before. So yeah, just being in tune with yourself and being authentic and vulnerable.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, and thank you to all panelists. Susan, did you have a last minute of remarks?
Yes, this has been such an amazing panel. Thank you to everyone. This conversation could obviously go on for hours because it's so rich. There's so much to say. There's so much to unpack here. And really, really, we're so fortunate to have you here with us today. I just wanted to remind people that that concludes our panelist for this morning. Next up is our sizzle reel, which is going to involve readings by many, many members of our community. So I encourage you to check out the sizzle reel here. Oh, there we go. Thank you, Carrie, for the sizzle reel. We also look at the schedule for this afternoon. We have workshops and then readings by most of our presenters. So most of the presenters and workshop facilitators will be doing brief readings. And we still have lots of festival to go. It's been absolutely an honor and a pleasure to have all of you. I want to remind everyone to go to Loyalty Books and please support. Okay, we might do this. There we go. Thank you, Carrie. Remind everyone to buy the books of our fabulous presenters and panelists, and also to help support the, this is all adoptee volunteer run. This entire festival has been organized and run by adoptee volunteers. And if you can donate even a little bit to this free experience that you're having today, we will be able to give honoraria to our wonderful panelists. It's just going to be a small gift, but the more you give, the bigger it will be. So we really hope that you will support our wonderful speakers through our Venmo. And thank you all for being here. So head on over to the sizzle reel, and then we will be doing workshops starting at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Thanks everyone for being here. Thank you, panelists. You're fabulous.
Thank you all.